Hi there, my name is Cian O'Donovan. I'm a researcher here at SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex, and welcome to today's Rethinking Society for the 21st Century. I guess first of all I want to make a couple of special welcomes to folks in the room. First of all, there's people not just from SPRU, but from all over the Sussex campus here today, so a special welcome to folks who have travelled from other departments. And if you like what you see, we do seminars every Friday. Come back and say hi to us. To the folks from the STEP Summer School, I know every year one of SPRU and the Institute of Development Studies highlights is the 2-week summer school for the STEP Centre. I believe there are approximately 42 students this year from 25 countries, so a really international cohort to talk about some international issues as we go. There's members of SPRU's advisory group here today. Thank you for the work that you do, and welcome. And colleagues at SPRU, it's a week after our teaching term has finished. You're still here, and you've still got smiles on your faces, so thanks for coming out. Okay, a little bit of housekeeping. We're not expecting any fires or fire alarms. If an alarm does go off, please leave the building. There's an exit there, there's an exit there, there's an exit there. And I'm going to suggest we reconvene at the steps of the library to continue this important discussion. So it's a nice day. We'll go out there and keep this going if we have to. Okay, why are we here? Ostensibly, we're here to launch a special collection of stories that has been published today on technologystories.com or .org. I encourage you to go there after this event and have a look at those. All about the role of technology, science, knowledge, and social progress. Technology Stories is a sister platform, an online sister platform for technology and culture, the journal of the Society for the History of Technology. And it engages readers with what it calls the usable past. And I think a call to action will go throughout today's event. These stories in turn mark the upcoming publication of what has been a 4-year, if not longer, project spanning 300 different academics across the social sciences and across the world under the banner of the International Panel on Social Progress. And a report called, a 22-chapter, 3-volume report about to be published by the Cambridge University Press, Rethinking Society for the 21st Century. Our panel members today have all contributed to that report, and indeed have other faculty across SPRU and Sussex. I see Rafi Kaplinski here, and it really has been an international effort. But rather than get lost in the totality of that report, in the references, the details of the chapters, and so on, we want to pull out the stories and discuss the usable content, the calls to action, and how we might achieve that. Stories of achievement towards social progress, stories of crises, and stories of everything in between, I think. So just a quick comment to me, maybe on some of the reasons why stories might matter. I think telling stories is an inherently political act. Hannah Arendt said that stories are the principal means by which to open up public space for active citizenship. So in this way, we come from a report to stories that might engender change and action in society. So we might want to think about how these stories, what these stories say about the present, how they may make us rethink the future, what kind of commitments do they inspire in us, and to whom? And how do we tell these stories to others, to colleagues, to peers, to politicians, to members of civil society, and so on? And I guess that's a call to you to get involved in this discussion today with our panel and start creating this dialogue. Okay, how are we going to do this? Appropriately, I think, for an international panel on social progress, we have convened an international panel. We've got 5 panel members sitting here at the front. I'll introduce them as we go. In the first half, we're going to hear from Helge and Johan about the role of science and technology in the report, and we might tell those stories. And in the second half, we'll have a discussion with the rest of our panel members on the stories themselves and what we might learn from them. So, leading us off is going to be Helge Nowotny. Helge is Professor of Science and Technology Studies at ETH in Zurich, and is a founding member of the European Research Council. And if I was to say one sentence about Helge, I'd say that Helge has significantly influenced how we think about knowledge, how knowledge is produced, and how knowledge is used in society. Helge has been a part of the steering committee for the international panel. She's contributed to a number of chapters, and indeed the Manifesto for Social Progress, which will be published alongside the wider report. And I think to technology stories, to our special stories, Helge has suggested contributions for the consideration of alternatives that lie at the heart of social sciences offer to society. So I'm going to leave it at that. Helge, I hope that is what you're expecting. Helge Nowotny. And here we go.
It's great to be here, especially considering this wonderful weather outside, your interest in the work that was done by more than 350 social scientists from all over the world. And I faced the impossible task to tell you something about 3 volumes that nobody has seen as yet, because Cambridge University Press will only deliver the publication end of May, and to make you interested in what can be done with it. Because one of the guiding questions for my professional life has always been, what follows? We work, we come up with findings, we have done interesting work, and then the question is, what follows? So that's the underlying theme of my very brief introduction here. The IPSP report needs to be put into a wider context. And that is, there are many international reports. The World Bank writes on poverty, OECD reports come out on a continuous basis. There are various other kinds, like the International Labour Organization that puts out work on the situation of work, etc., etc. So what is different? And there's one international panel that served as a kind of model, but only to some extent, and that is the International Panel on Climate Change. And it was a model in the sense that the IPCC managed to get together people working in the environmental sciences, interested in climate change, for a continuous number of years, bringing out reports, where do we stand? The difference, however, is the IPCC was reporting to governments. And this means there were fights over the wording. You know, is it 1.5 degrees that the warming can go up, or what will happen then? While the IPSP was a bottom-up initiative. We had no sponsor. We had no government to be addressed. So it is an international bottom-up initiative. And this has advantages because we are completely free to say what we want without any kind of censorship or, trying to anticipate what your addressee would like you to say. On the other hand, and this is why such an opening is very important, the report has knowledge that needs to be distributed. Its findings have to be taken up and worked on, and it's very much work in progress. So, including an international perspective, including different stakeholders, is part of the spirit. But there's also something that the authors call a normative compass. A compass that should orient where do you look, how do you filter and analyze what you are seeing. And the normative compass is very much oriented towards human dignity as one of the fundamental principles for our world if we want to be able to live together also in the 21st century. And of course, social justice and other principles that come with it that I'm not going into it. But in every chapter, you will see the normative compass, the needle. It's never completely fixed, but as with the compass, you can see it points in a direction and it invites you to follow this direction. So it also allows a report to engage in a much longer time perspective than many of the other reports, which are triggered or timed according to political panels meeting, or you have elections, or you have other political events that determine the timing. And the IPSP report, it's the 21st century. And there are long-term views, structural issues that we have the privilege and the obligation and responsibility to take into account. And I think besides the normative compass, this is one of the strengths here, not just to look ahead to the immediate future, but to engage in a more long-term time perspective, what it might mean. Very briefly on the structure, it consists of 3 parts and 2 concluding chapters. The first part essentially is devoted to a description and analysis. Where are we going? The trends, not so surprising, inequalities are growing, although, and this is one perhaps surprising piece of information for you, we can see that overall on the planet, inequality has declined, but within countries it is increasing. And this, of course, is also the reason for many of the tensions we feel, et cetera, et cetera. So by taking this global view, you get interesting contradictory trends also that need to be fitted into an overall picture, obviously. So the first part speaks about possible reforms also. Cities, it looks at financial markets, what is happening there. It looks at demographic changes. It looks at questions like, does capitalism have a future? The answer is yes, but. And many possible reforms that are considered while looking at the trends. The second part has the title Regulation, Governance, Transformation. It's concerned with questions of legitimacy and loss of legitimacy. Why is it that so many liberal democracies are under assault these days in Europe, not to speak about the rest of the world? And what are these newly emerging talks of illiberal democracy, etc.? So what has happened to bring us to this, into this situation? And what does it mean in terms of how to deal with populistic movements, how to deal with corruption that is one of the most widespread ills everywhere around the globe, undermining whatever progress is made stepwise. The third part looks at transformations in values, in norms, and in cultures. It has chapters on religion, on global health, on education, and interesting for an international audience also, what I would call the ghosts of modernization theory. One of the, the showpieces in the 60s and 70s of the social sciences was modernization theory. We have found the model, the rest of the world will follow. This did not happen, as we know. And so the ghosts of the modernization theory is still around in many ways, and in some of these chapters, modernity is juxtaposed to the goals of modernization theory. And then there are two concluding chapters. One chapter that tries to get a better understanding of the unevenness of progress. There's, of course, not one meaning of progress. It's a multiple dimensional concept, it's a relational concept, etc. But above all, what is so striking is the unevenness also of the different dimensions of what we understand by the term of progress. Why is this happening, and how can we get a better grasp of it? Then there is also a look at institutional innovations, very important institutions. And another red thread throughout the report is the importance of markets. Whether we like it or not, markets are here to stay. Corporations are here to stay, even if we think they should be reformed, they should be restructured. And how to grapple with what markets do, how they function now, how they fail, and we know there's a lot of market failure going on, and what can be done about markets. And then it also, this concluding chapter, it also tries to encourage social scientists to be much more open towards experimentation. We have missed many opportunities in terms of ideas that we have to put them to an experimental test. And it's not something that is left only to the natural sciences. There are ways of doing experiments under controlled conditions to find out what works under which conditions and under which preconditions. And then there is a final chapter, and this is another thread that runs through the report: policy matters. Contrary to what some social scientists think, there is no point in going into policy work. I know here at SPRU it's different. You're very much focused on policy work. And the report follows by showing in 6 domains what difference has it made? What can we say? What has policy achieved? Not surprisingly, policies in the social sciences, if they have any impact at all, and they do have impact, work in very indirect ways, very seldom in direct ways. And what are some of the conditions under which they work? The domains differ. It goes from developmental studies, it goes to education, it goes to science, technology, innovation, etc. And again, one thread that runs through is look at the role of markets in the way how policies are taken up, not taken up, integrated or not, etc. And then at the very end, there is a kind of overview of where the social sciences have come from, and the message is it could be different. It can be different. There are alternatives. Now, in the remaining minutes, I don't know how many I have, I would like to take a personal view on what can be done with such a report. The report certainly was meant also to stimulate other researchers. It's an imperfect report, as you can imagine, but to take up some of the topics and to keep working. And the metaphor I would like to use here is that of maps. Think of the report as being a series or a cluster of different kind of maps that are superimposed. There are maps that tell you something about disciplines, something about regions of the world, something about the way how a problem is being approached. And it gives you a feeling of the different terrains on which the social sciences are standing and where they are working. And think of a map as a knowledge aggregator. A map is a fantastic piece of visualizing a lot of knowledge and data, but it is static. Once you have drawn the map, it does not change until you move on to the next map. And I would like us to think of the report and the maps that it contains as interactive maps. And modern technology allows us to have interaction with maps. I have colleagues working on that. And I would really hope that the report is taken up as a kind of interactive map to engage with. So my personal take on it is, first of all, I think it is very positive that the social sciences have been able to speak with one voice as social sciences, and that we have got economists on board, because there are many economists who think they are not social scientists anymore. And personally, I think it was one of the greatest tragedies in the history of social sciences when political economy was no longer a topic to be taught, and economists started to disassociate themselves from being a social science, and vice versa. The blame is not just the blame to be put on economists, but here the economists are on board. And dealing with society, dealing with the natural sciences, is one of the very rare occasions where you can say social sciences are brought together and they speak with one voice. Secondly, the report, through this normative compass, through this emphasis on think in terms of alternatives, think in terms of institutional innovations, experiment with ideas, see what works. It is an invitation to rethink, to redefine, to restructure, to reload concepts like you have all been dealing with impact of your work in many ways. Think of reloading a concept like impact. What would it look like? So this is another way. I think the report has a very emancipatory message to convey. Thirdly, I think the report also makes us reflect on our ways of knowing. We are all working within an academic setting here, and academia as an institution, universities, we all know how they function, the problems there are, etc. We are working in this kind of setting, and it has an impact. It shapes the way how we produce knowledge. And the challenge I see is to step outside and to think, are there new ways of knowing, of generating knowledge, of distributing knowledge, of reaching people outside academia, and to involve different perspectives and somehow try to bring them together. So in a sense, it's also about repositioning expertise. And we have had a period now of fake news, of the denigration of experts in general, by the media, by politicians, etc. So how are we going to reposition ourselves? Just by saying we know and others don't know, we know better and the others don't know, this will not get us very far. So how are we going to reposition our expertise that we undoubtedly have? And who will certify what is good research if we are distributing the knowledge we have? So these are open questions. There are also some interesting attempts to think what can be done around it. But it's an open question. And last but not least, coming from STS and having this panel discussion here afterwards, I think the word social progress has a reflective message for us. because the emphasis is on social progress, and yet we know when you mention the word progress, most people will think of technological progress. And social progress somehow be lagging behind, coming afterwards, trying to remediate some of the injustices brought about by technological advances, etc., etc. And I feel that in the 21st century, we may face a paradox in the sense that we see with technology advancing, with digitalization taking over, with automation shaping the way how people will work, we see a kind of movement in that area of the social and technological coming together in ways that no one is able as yet to clearly spell out. But these will be hybrid forms, these will be different ways of patches, assemblages being brought together. And the paradox, in my view, consists, we can see this is a mega trend in which we are moving. And on the other hand, if we look at societies, we see a fragmentation. We see an ongoing fragmentation in the sense of having more cleavages, of having people living in bubbles and losing the capability to reach out and speak and communicate with each other. So these are some of the challenges that I think the report opens up, and it is left to all of us to continue to think about it, to work about it in answering the question, what follows? Thank you.
Thanks, Helga. Helga, stay there. I want to allow the audience to have some questions directly to yourself to start with. So if anybody has some questions, we've got about 10 minutes for questions for Helga. Please do put up your hand.
That's a bit of a challenge. It could seem, given the ambition of the report and the scale of the work, quite a conventional format. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about that. So what it ends up as is a 3-volume Cambridge University Press book. Yes, just that.
Well, I think you put your finger on a weak spot. We were hoping that everyone, because 350 people around the world have access to different media as well. But then it is left to the initiative of each one. So events like this will take place in other parts, in Latin America, in Europe, in various places. But I personally, I think, yes, it would have been nice, to use different kinds of media as well to get to the point. But on the other hand, I'm quite confident that, ideas that are worth to be taken up, ideas where we feel a tension, that irritate us, will find their way into other media and find their way to be discussed. So think of it again, the metaphor of the map that I was using. You use a map to find your way, but no one is telling you where you should go. You are using a compass because it helps you to find the direction, but it's you who has to say, this is where I would like to go. So the report from this point of view offers, you're right, a conventional way of reading, of interpreting, of discussing with students or talking to policymakers, etc. But on the other hand, ideas, if you go back to the history of ideas, if you go back to the beginning of modern science or before, if you go back to the Enlightenment, ideas find their ways to unlikely places through unlikely networks. That's what, historians tell us that has happened. and who thinks you have an enlightenment in St. Petersburg in the 18th century. Yeah? So how did ideas get there? To absolutist state in the 18th century, etc. So ideas have a way of getting around, but of course they are connected to people. They are connected to networks. They are connected to something that drives people to explore certain questions and think they matter more than others. And so I am reasonably optimistic that people will look to the report as a map that helps them to, position themselves or position problems where they are and then go beyond it.
Thanks, Helga. Marion has a question up there.
Hello. I'm not sure if this is too general a question, but I wanted to ask, as a result of the working report, do you have more faith in social progress? And what's the trajectory that you see? Do you see us moving towards more human dignity and social justice? Do you think that we are improving? And yeah, what's your vision of social progress in that kind of broad sense?
Well, I don't think I have faith in much in general, because I tend to be rather on the skeptical side. And I think it's good if you have doubts as well as strong beliefs. But looking at the history of humankind, undeniably there has been progress. Undeniably there has also been barbarian, terrible recesses, falling back into a brutality of mind, of doing things to each other that does not fit into the vision we have of a humanity progressing in any sense. So this is part of our history as humans. And I would say it can happen anytime again. So from this point of view, I don't think there is any kind of guarantee that it would not happen. Think of the 20th century, but you can go back every century in history, every place around the world, you find terrible stories of what humans have been doing to other humans. That's the dark side of our history, and this will not go away. On the other hand, we see more people on the planet are living better lives. Much more needs to be done, no doubt, but we see that. We see the enormous lengthening of human lifespan, enormous. We see global health efforts progressing. So you have one step forward, half a step backwards, sometimes 2 steps backwards, but there is something moving on. Now, if you go to the 21st century and with the rapid scientific and technological progress we are seeing today, there are, so to say, 2 scenarios that people like Bostrom, he says we have only 2 possibilities ahead of us. One is we wipe each other out, so the end of humanity as we know it, or it's exit to space. So you can choose. And while I'm also skeptical about seeing the world only in terms of such stark scenarios, either or if you think of Ray Kurzweil's singularity, the point that is not so far ahead in the 30s, where algorithms and the computers in which they have been embedded will be able to do everything better than we can. So we will become kind of slaves of algorithms. Yeah? So here I am skeptical, while admitting things might happen that we don't want to happen. But at the same time, I think, especially science, technology, and also what STS stands for, gives us the possibility to reflect on these developments and to come up with answers that are not technologically determined. So it's very much, my stand is very much against any kind of determinism, be it genetic determinism, be it technological determinism. We have the possibility as humans to think, we have the possibility to reflect, we have the possibility to educate the next generations, perhaps also with more alternatives than what we do now, or we should think of more alternatives to what we do now. So we are moving forward, but again, there's no guarantee and nothing is an even way forward.
Thanks, Helga. That's great. One question, couple of questions goes a huge amount, a long way there. So let's move on. I'm going to welcome up Johan Schut, who is the director of SPRU. Johan is a professor of the history of technology as well as sustainability transitions studies. And Johan, with Helga, has contributed a cross-cutting theme of the report that has looked specifically at the role of science and technology in society across these multiple different themes and chapters of the report. Johan.
Okay. Do you hear me? Yes. Okay. Then I do without the mic. Well, the question about the book, we also have put up today blogs, so about the format. So go to technologystories.org and you'll find stories. Technology stories. I will tell you one story. That's the story about Luddism. Have you heard about the Luddites? So who were the Luddites? They were people smashing machines. So they were irrational people because they got angry about these machines changing their lives and they smashed them. And history, the verdict in history was, and also the verdicts by the Marxists, and in fact by the unions, this was the wrong type of action, smashing machines. What we need to do is appropriate the benefits of the machines, of course for labor, but not smash them. Well, the story should have been different, because the Luddites were not against machines. They were against specific machines. So when they would enter a factory, and there would be 30 machines, they would only smash 2. They would smash the machines that would have effect on their skills. And would also have effect on the quality of society. Because in their mind, if you build machines that would create huge unemployment, you would degrade the quality of society. In fact, they had another vision about the future. They were called backward, but they were not backward, they were forward-looking. They said, we want another type of society. And in that society, there's space for innovation, yes, but not for all innovation, only for a specific type of innovation. Innovation which does not de-skill people. So they had very specific visions, but their visions vanished. And we got a society, a modern society, in which technology has a very specific role to play. Technology now is seen as the great mobilizer, as bringing innovation, novelty, and bringing the good life. That is the story about technology. And if you look to the report of the International Panel on Climate Change, you see technology will bring the solution. So when we heard about the report, and I was invited by Helga, we were discussing how should we deal with science and technology in this report. Because it needs to be a different story. It cannot be this story about technology bringing social progress. So what is the connection, in fact, between science, technology, and social progress? We wanted to bring an STS perspective and a history of technology perspective to this. The problem is, of course, that science and technology studies has no patience for social progress. If you go to science technology studies, you will see to talk about social progress, that's the past. It's a difficult thing to talk about. How can we talk about social progress at all? Can we talk about social progress? So in a way, that was at stake for me in the report. So how can we talk about social progress through the lens of science, technology, and innovation? Well, we came up with a number of principles to do this. And one principle is that we have to talk about the socio-technical. We should never talk only about the technical and never talk only about the social, but we should talk about the social-technical and the relationship, which is a specific contribution STS made to how to analyze social change. So it means that when you talk about a specific machine, you need to look at the values embedded in that machine, and you need to see how that machine is connected to social, economic, and cultural processes. So we wanted to avoid technological determinism in the report, but also social determinism. The second principle was that who is innovative? Is it only the engineer or the scientist? Or also civil society, the user? So we wanted to have to pay attention to a broad set of innovators contributing to social progress and assess their contribution. And of course, gender comes in here, and also the kind of ethnicity aspects. The third thing is that we say social progress is not one path. There are many models. So if you look at the modernization and industrialization process, you can see that it unfolds in many ways. So we wanted to pay attention to multiple pathways, not just one, and pay attention to the path dependencies, but also what we called the hidden alternatives. Next, we didn't want a diffusion story, as if modernization started in Great Britain with the Industrial Revolution and spread over the world, but more a story where you can see that new things happen in many places in the world and become connected. So a circulation model. And then we wanted to ask questions about social progress for whom, for what purpose, and make clear that social progress is emergent. We need to put work in it constantly. So to come back to the question about do we see social progress, my personal view is that we live in a time where we have to come up with new solutions, a new social contract, you may call it, around science, technology, and innovation. Because if we fail to do that, we will not see social progress in the future. So we have to become Luddites again, and if we were to become Luddites and be more successful than the Luddites in the past, yes, we will see social progress.
Let's take another couple of responses, questions, comments. Yeah. It's going.
Just the other day, I was investigating technology around the Internet of Things, and I came across this killing phrase to me, the economy of things, and discovered a whole series of new systems which effectively, instead of creating a cultural commons around sensors and networks, just connected commodities and resources which were communicating their value to each other without any real human connection. And I was fairly horrified by that. What are your observations about the likelihood of a commons emerging in some of the newer network forms that we might see around us? That's obviously a question about the social value rather than, the sort of economic value of that.
Well, I don't think the delegation to technology is itself the problem. The question how it is done, who is in control, and under what kind of conditions. Facebook, is able to build an empire without much control. So I think the real question is, so how can we build governance structures which allow to have more control over these technologies, but also that the people who work on these technologies think about the social consequences early on. So for example, a development as responsible research and innovation is a very important development from my perspective, because that would allow scientists and engineers to look again at the consequences. So we live in a society where the sciences and the engineers are completely disconnected from the social sciences, but it works both ways. We social scientists do not interact enough with the scientists and the engineers, and they don't interact with us. So they build these systems without any social knowledge often embedded. It's embedded, their vision, but there's no interaction with the social sciences. And that's a problem.
Eric.
Yeah, I'd like to ask, if I may, a question about Luddite, the Luddites.
Yeah, the Luddites, yeah.
You characterise them, I think historically correctly, not as opposing machinery, but opposing a subset of technologies, namely skill displacing.
Yes.
Is that what you are currently advocating? Because is there not a risk in that what you end up proposing is living in a museum? So let's take the example. We're both wearing spectacles. Traditionally, spectacles were made, lenses were made by highly skilled lens grinders. And the proportion of the population who could have spectacles was microscopic. Now they're made by machinery so quickly that you can actually, you can get your eyes checked and get your spec before you leave the opticians. But in doing so, they have destroyed skills, but made it much easier for many people to have spectacles at much lower cost. So, are there not some skills we want to preserve and others we can let go?
Well, the question about the Luddites is a bit broader, because they were not, they were angry about the de-skilling, but they were more angry about two other things. One is that the degradation of the quality of society, and that they were not participating in the process of deciding. Because machine breaking was a way of participating. They said, because in the guilds, the original governance structures, they had a say. So I think we need processes where more people can participate in deciding on the socio-technical futures we want. So we need to open up places where choices are made to more participation.
Hi, Alan. I'm interested in the fact that you said that we're unlikely to achieve social progress without a new form of social contract.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what prospect there is for a new social contract. What are the odds of us being able to frame such a contract, given the rate of change in technology at the moment? So I'm thinking the fact that a new social contract presumably will be driven largely by policymakers, as well as by people in the commons, by civil society and other parts of society. But how do we go about framing such a contract in a world where technology moves so rapidly and may well overtake any hope of us actually framing such a contract?
Well, a social contract, signing that, is not a rational process. So if you look historically, the way I look, the welfare state was a social contract. So how did the welfare state emerge? Because of threat of revolution. So in the 19th century, many problems piled up. We had social movements. They protested. So the state was built partly to deal with some of the social consequences. We had two world wars where the elite started to realize they needed to do something about some of these social consequences. So the process will not be a kind of easy process. So in general, when the threat of revolution is big enough, the elite will give in, because their own future is threatened. So what we will see is a lot of problems and a lot of mobilization around these problems. And the question more about the new social progress is, can we avoid some of the bigger catastrophes in order to get to a situation where some of the real world problems are addressed? Because these problems will not go away. So we will have to sort out, and there are many ways of dealing with them, and better ways and worse ways. So the question is, what will happen? So it's about, in a way, the cost of moving to the social contract. So I don't believe in this kind of, complete, well, what was it, catastrophe of, we will wipe out the human beings and go to space. I think there's a lot in between. But it's more about who will bear the cost, who will pay for the and how many people will pay. So it's about the distribution aspect. That's the most important aspect.
Great. Thanks, Johan. Let's move on, and I want to invite our 3 other contributors now in quick succession. So we'll do 3 quick-fire presentations on the level of the story. So we've had the overview of the entire project from Helga. Johan has introduced us, I think, to some concepts that might help us with distribution of the benefits and costs of science and technology, and indeed telling the stories of different actors. So I'm going to move on now to our 3rd speaker, Suzanne Moon. Suzanne is an associate professor in the history of science at the University of Oklahoma. She's editor of Technology and Culture, the journal of the Society for the History of Technology, and indeed the founding editor of Technology Stories, where these stories appear, as Johan mentioned. And Suzanne contributed to an intriguing chapter in the IPSP report on religion and social progress. So Suzanne.
Right. Thank you very much. Yeah, so working on the religion chapter was sort of interesting in 2 ways. One way, of course, is that if I ask you quick, what does religion have to do with science and technology, there might be some silence. And indeed, the lead authors of the chapter weren't entirely sure what to do with science and technology. So I want to kind of just go quickly over a couple of ways that this came into the project. One of the big issues with the religion chapter to start with is that when the organizers put this together, their kind of overriding question is, what do we do about all this religion that's obstructing real progress? That was the way that they kind of framed the issue of religion. And yet, when you put a room full of religious studies scholars, I was the only non-religious studies scholar in the room. When you put a bunch of religious studies scholars in the room, their response is, what are you talking about? Because while, of course, there are many interesting examples of religiously based obstruction of progress, at the same time, you also have a lot of quite important examples of places where religious actors play a significant and leading role in kind of advocacy for social justice, for example. And so what this made me think about in general was sort of this question of what stories do we end up telling about religion and progress? What are the ones we hear? Clearly, the organizers had mainly heard the negative stories, but they hadn't heard the other kind of stories. Now, when the coordinating lead authors and the group of authors as a whole came up with their conclusions for the chapter, one of the things they said is, well, first, you need a lot more religious literacy. But the second thing they said is, one of the things to keep in mind about religion is that religious actors do tend to have enormous reach. They are often in contact with communities who are absolutely the ones who are dealing with the worst aspects of injustice. And furthermore, the kind of backing they can give to discussion about progress is deeply rooted in things that people care about. So they, as they argue, what you really need instead are partnerships between secular and non-secular groups, but as they would then kind of phrase that as well-judged partnerships. So the ghosts of modernization theory, this was one of the big issues in our group, was the modernization theory, of course, and preceding Enlightenment thought, all sort of argued that religion is something that would slowly retreat out of public life into private life, and then implicitly simply wither away entirely. But the reality is, it just isn't true. About 80% of the world currently professes some kind of spiritual religious affiliation of a serious nature. That number is growing, not shrinking. And in terms of, and this isn't really a recent phenomenon either, it's actually a fairly sort of stable aspect of things. So if we really want to grapple with the idea of social progress, we also have to grapple with the place of religion in all of this. So the first point I want to deal with is how this problem, and I'm just going to call this in my essay that I'm finishing now, the Enlightenment baggage that we deal with. One of the strains of Enlightenment thought essentially says that you have science on one side and you have religion on the other, and this is the old conflict thesis about science and religion. And yet, if you look a little more closely, you find that, of course, historically, that doesn't hold up. But even in contemporary world, where you can find instances of conflict between science and religion, you can also find instances where there's an awful lot more connection there than people people often will discuss. And let me give you just a very quick example from some of the parts of the chapter where we looked at climate change. So you'll probably know that American evangelicals are sort of famous for denying climate change. And yet, if you take a closer look at those statistics, what you find is that actually American climate change deniers, who are evangelicals, well, the numbers aren't that different from white middle-class Americans, period. There's clearly something else at work here rather than, say, simply evangelical practice. You can also find other evangelical groups that are actually working on behalf of environmental change. But so it's useful to kind of think about where is that actually coming from. So I found a couple of NGOs that work on this, including one called the Evangelical Environmental Network. And their basis for essentially telling people that it's not just generically important to work for environmental change, that it's actually a spiritual duty. And their point for doing this is because of obligation to future generations. They kind of frame this in terms of a set of commitments to what they call sort of pro-life commitments. That is how they kind of frame it. There is an opportunity there for anybody who's working on working on climate change from the perspective of intergenerational justice. There's a real opportunity for partnerships there that could be completely overlooked if you don't really kind of understand where people's opposition or ability to work with this comes from. I could give other examples as well. Probably the most important one from the evangelical community is from the community outside the United States, which actually came up with something called the Cape Town Commitment, which again kind of advocates a spiritual duty to work on the problems of climate. So there's clearly some idea that religion is on one side, science on the other. This is a problem that doesn't really kind of line up with what actually happens in the world necessarily. A second kind of problem we see that again sort of stems from certain strains of Enlightenment thinking is a tendency to see religion as something that is otherworldly, that it's about a next life. Well, certainly that's important for some religions, not for all. But also there's this kind of idea that actually most religions are deeply interested in what's happening in this world, that transforming this particular world is actually a serious job. And we can kind of think about what are the implications for people who are sort of assuming that religion is one thing when it may be lived in kind of different ways. So my very quick example of this is in the early 2000s, there was a lawsuit brought by the Navajo and Hopi nations in the United States because against a ski resort operator who was spraying treated sewage on a sacred mountain. And ultimately, the judge ruled against the Hopi and Navajo nation, saying that because religion is purely mental activity, there's no way that any sort of material harm could really harm somebody's religious practice. As far as I know, the Hopi and Navajo are still trying to find ways to fight this. But you can kind of see that there's a lot of things happening with this judge's ruling. I feel sure that if that ski resort operator was spreading treated sewage in a Christian church, that he would have ruled the other way. I mean, we have a very significant kind of racist and colonial sort of aspects of this story that we can't ignore. At the same time, the fact that you can kind of trot out this talk about religion, the idea that it can be something mental that has no kind of material aspects, is actually seriously problematic. And in this case, it's really being used to kind of promote a sort of injustice. So this is one reason that we kind of have to put this Enlightenment baggage aside, or at least tell stories that help to kind of challenge those sort of Enlightenment viewpoints. Do I have any more time? Okay, all right. So the other point that I wanted to make, getting to technology, and I don't really have time to go into much detail with this, is to say something about the spaces where people are living religious lives, and I'm calling this in my essay, techno-religious lives, that we can kind of see in modern religious, everyday religious practices are kind of deeply intertwined with things like social media, with different sorts of technological tools and behaviors that you might not necessarily think of as religious. But if we accept for the moment that for a large portion of the world, religious sites are places where people really work to develop sorts of moral meanings in their lives, where people engage in what you might say are moral deliberations, then you also kind of have to pay attention to the way that these new kinds of sites for talking about morality need to be taken seriously, that they're not sort of pathological, they're not kind of compromises of real spirituality, but actually kind of new emergent forms of spirituality, and I would say new and more emergent sites of spiritual behavior, that if you want to take a very inclusive approach to thinking about social progress, you kind of need to grapple with the way that people are constantly, sort of dynamically changing the way that they engage in spiritual practice and the way they engage each other in spiritual practice. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. So we're going to take 3 in a row, and then we're going to have a bigger discussion session. So I'm particularly going to look at our STEPS cohort here to be saving up questions and writing them down for that discussion. Let's introduce Judith Sutz next. Judith is a professor of science, technology, and society from the Universidad de la República in Uruguay. Judith visits us as the first ever visiting Freeman Fellow here at SPRU and Sussex, which is great. And she has contributed to the Rethinking Society chapter on inequality and social progress. And if I do that, Judith, you should be able to...
Okay. How do I go?
Press down there.
This is to change. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I am the only one using PowerPoint because my English is not so good, so perhaps you will understand better that way. So I would like to reflect briefly on 3 points. On the mediated relationship between science and technology and social progress, changing mediation, building a different future, and the challenge ahead, a small story and a plea up for politics. On the mediated relations, the work of the International Panel on Social Progress makes clear that the relationship between science, technology, and social progress are not immediate, They are, on the contrary, mediated by social, economic, and political issues, and particularly by power relations. For example, we are all worried today by an apparently unstoppable process of job transformation that is putting at risk hundreds of thousands of jobs. Who commands these changes? Who pays engineers and other science and technology people to design in such a way that the result is hundreds of thousands of existing jobs transformed in something meaningless? Who? Of course, there are positive mediation, but inequality may liquefy its benefits, as so often happens, for instance, in the realm of health. So, the relationship between science, technology, and social progress indeed are mediated by these things. If this is so, things could have been different if the mediation would have been different. Nothing is written in stone regarding the way in which we build the artifact that shapes our life. Nothing is as it is because a science and technology, ineluctable fate determines so. As Louis Mumford used to say, trend is not destiny. Science and technology, Tina, there is no alternative, is a socially unacceptable perspective. This means that social progress may not be the small sister of science and technology, taking from its hands results driven by the interest of those who presently command the production of knowledge and innovation. It may become the big sister, setting the rules of the game through giving normative guidance. If social progress understood democratically takes the upper hand in design, then science and technology may follow other trends, and this would indeed lead to a different future. Two challenges ahead, a small story and a plea for politics. Challenge one, a knowledge-based inequality prevails in contemporary world. This is Charles Tilly, 2005 assertion. Need will be to sail against the wind, so social progress and diminishing inequality may set some of the goals for science and technology. Challenge two, to think in radically new ways. Need will be to open doors, windows, everything you can open to allow radically new ways of thinking and doing, of defining problems and of solving them. Technology pluralism is key, including the acceptance of polysemy regarding important concepts. Example, what means frugal innovation? The other day, Johan, Rodrigo, and I were discussing about what means frugal innovation. And Johan said, frugal innovation is about modularity. It's about not throwing away the whole artifact because you need to change these things, very small things. It needs less inbuilt complexity. Okay. But for me, coming from a developing country, frugal innovation has this Gandhi sense, doing at least as well or better with dramatically less resources. And to obtain this conceptualization of frugality, you may need very complex, indeed, procedures. Let's then give an example. This is the small technology story. The story is like this. Newborn children with severe jaundice coming from poor neighborhoods are treated in public maternity hospital in Uruguay. The treatment consists on a lamp of blue light, a very precise light. But given that the lamp is done by LEDs, and each LED has very low intensity, you need a lot of LEDs. This means that the lamp is too much expensive, and so the hospital cannot build it. A physicist at the university get to know the problem, and how is another story. And he built a concentrator of light that allow to have the same intensity, but with tens less LEDs, which means the lamp was very cheap, and it was small enough to be put into an incubator. The lamp is this. And the question is, how did the physicist got to know about the problem? And the answer is because his father was a neonatologist in the public hospital. That means He got to know the problem by chance. But for rethinking and reshaping the future, chance is not enough. And anecdotes like this one is not enough in the middle of a sea of trends going in another direction. We need to change trends. Anecdotes usually developed in niche tell us that this is not an impossibility in science and technology terms, which is important, because plurality in technological terms is something that is missing today. For this, a great conversion of diverse forces need to be convened, following the wide, comprehensive, and pluralistic orientation set by the International Panel of Social Progress. However, nobody will be able to convene the whole of such forces. Let me, to finish, express my conviction that we, university people, have in our hands the possibility to unleash an extremely powerful force to shape the future, that of the solidarity and commitment of our students. If they, as future researchers or practitioners, remain aware of the social responsibility associated with the knowledge they possess and apply and may grow, then anecdote proving that things may be done differently will blossom, pushing trends to change. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. Some really powerful imagery there, I think, both in the pictures and in the words. So thank you very much for that contribution. Our last contributor for the day is going to be on this international panel, the only Englishman. From SPRU, this is Andy Sterling, Professor of Science and Technology Policy to the IPSP, and he contributed to a chapter on the multiple directions of social progress. Yeah. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Shall I use this? I guess I should. So thank you. There's not a lot left to say. That was wonderful, those talks, and there's going to be a lot of chiming, but I'll just go straight in on what I wanted to add to this. I was really grateful to Helga and Johan for the delight of finding myself assigned in this posse of science and technology studies people to the chapter called The Multiple Directions. You can imagine, anyone who knows me, how exciting that was for me. And I'll tell you a little bit about what happened there. But the reason I was excited, though, is because I think that, for reasons that have been articulated really well, is a core of the issue. There are so many important issues we've heard about, but that multiplicity. And one way of getting a handle on that is to think what I understand to be, one day I'm going to be completely blown out of the water on this, but I understand it's a rule of thumb in ethnography that if you want to get a quick handle on what the key axis of tension is in a particular society, ask about the origin myth. Because in the origin myth will be, whether it's a racial story, or usually it's gender, but the people of this kind, the people of that kind, there will be some story about that, explaining why some manifest injustice is perpetuated because of something that happened. So what is the origin myth of modernity? It's progress. And that same rule applies in the modernity village, which is now horrifically bloated worldwide, that the whole story of humanity is about this notion, this linear, deterministic, singular unfolding of this inevitable thing, which is never fully accountable, because whenever you try and push it, as we've heard, then you get back, no, it's networked, no, it's not like this. But the underlying language is of that kind. That's why around the world now we hear this language of the way forward, with the on the front, as if that's meaningful. Isn't the whole point of politics that we're arguing about the way forward? So how can you say the way forward? Pro-innovation, science-based, when what innovation is, as we've heard, or what science is multiple. And yet around the world that language is asserted time and again. And it's not just in the high-level language of policymakers in very different political cultures that are in other respects really in tension with one another. It's also in the technical language, coming indeed from communities around SPRU and our own disciplines, around concepts like catching up, leapfrogging, falling behind, forging ahead, technical terms that only have meaning in the context of this one-track singular race. So I feel this multiplicity is a really radical point that the International Panel on Social Progress is really helping to make a possibility for. And as Johan and Judith in particular have emphasized, this is of course mediated by power. It's not just that people need explaining to them that progress is multiple. It's because that's a very inconvenient message, because few resources are more expedient for entrenched interests of any kind than there is no alternative, as we've just heard. So I think what the IPSP is doing by focusing the whole report on progress is politicizing, in the best sense of that term, the normative compass that Helga talked about, this central myth of modernity, and the implications are enormous. Because arguably, alongside other innovations like the Sustainable Development Goals, like around the world these deeply flawed institutions, but they are nonetheless in an adverse climate, proliferating for public engagement, coming out of technology assessment, for responsible innovation, for inclusive innovation, deeply flawed in particular settings, but nonetheless trying to move forward. These institutional innovations together are about what you could say is as important as the advent of modernity itself, the realization that, hey, we can improve society, we can improve things. Well, this is about not only can social agency be exercised over the possibility of improvement, it's that social agency can be exercised over the direction of that improvement. And that's a political importance at least equal to the advent of modernity itself, I think. So excited was I about this, I rushed in and started enthusiastically trying to assume all that was the case, and I discovered actually how that point of view common in STS, absolutely embedded in STS, is not shared by even the most progressive of social scientists, for whom actually there was a big discussion, multiple, what does that mean? We should make uneven, as Helga read, the uneven direction of progress. Obviously progress is singular. So there was quite interesting discussions on that, but I won't bang on too much, maybe some of the details were quite illuminating. My final point about the report itself, because I've wrestled, as we all have, with it. It's an amazing thing. It's too long, it's too technical, there are too many overlapping bits, there's too many biases, there's too many gaps, it's going to be criticized for being too political, too apolitical, too left, also too right, probably. The geography, the gender, the racial mix, the class mix, I mean, you can't even see class, the class mix is probably absolutely abysmal. So all these things will be very criticized in the coming months and years, and rightly so. And I remembered, it's a sort of military metaphor, which I'm not prone to, but there was apparently at the disastrous charge of the Light Brigade, when this entire regiment charged against artillery, there was an onlooking French general who said, "C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre." It's magnificent, but it's not war. And I looked at this and I think, it's magnificent, but it's not policy. You know, it's what's going to happen with this charge of these 3 volumes. But despite those things, points that have been made already really well come out to me about the report as a whole. It's reporting, as Helga said, to society, not to governments. That's really crucial. That, in fact, there is no cockpit. The directions of progress are set by distributed processes through society. That is exactly the right place for it to speak. It's informing more substantive debate, because it does matter. Knowledge matters, and it's conveying that in an extremely fine-grained way. But most crucially, I think, it's catalyzing a wider, vibrant politics, a politics of progress that hasn't really hitherto existed, suppressed as it is by the myth that I've just talked about. And in a time of populism and manipulalism, authoritarianism around the world, when the horizons look grim, this is more important than ever, because actually, arguably, progress itself, history, doesn't unfold as a trajectory, but as tides and waves. So just at a time in the world when we see these grim forces at work, this is, along with many other things, a sign of another force. It's a back current, it's a reaction current, which can be used to make us start talking in multiple ways, where the disagreement is as important as the agreements, about the possibility not only of a politics of progress, but of actually democratizing progress itself. So that's why I was as excited as I was about the process. Thanks.
We've got about 25 minutes or so to ask questions and pull out some further bits and pieces that we may do. I'm going to ask Helga and Johan and Suzanne and Judith and Andy to face the audience and make this a little bit more collaborative. Thank you very much. And I'm going to take a couple of questions at a time, or comments.
Thank you very much. It's interesting to see it coming to fruition after seeing it emerge. But one thing I would like to ask is around the idea of multiplicity and the extent to which it's open and sort of, is it an infinite multiplicity or is it a bounded multiplicity? And we need to talk about, if you want, sort of efforts to prioritize and efforts to kind of manage that multiplicity. In the sense that, yes, there are many possible sort of technical futures, but in terms of making policy and considering kind of democratic options, we need to some extent be able to discuss a limited set on which we can then sort of make policy and discuss. And of course there are problems about it, but I just wonder what are your thoughts on that kind of boundedness and the processes that come with it.
Thanks, Jonas. I mean, another way to think about that might be on the poster, which guided many of you here, we had one arrow pointing to the right. We might ask, what kind of other arrows do we need on that poster for next time, and where should they be pointing?
I would say that I don't really know if this is quite an answer or not, but I think one of the things that came out of the discussions that I was a part of is dialogue. That this can't always be top down. In fact, if it is top down, it's going to be fairly self-defeating at a certain point. So there is a way of thinking about, well, we need to make policy, and it feels like it's always up here. And so a lot of the conversation we had was about how is it that you bring different parties into these dialogues so that actually you can find a way to grapple with that multiplicity without simply just sort of shoving some bits to the side.
Yeah, I would like to link it, the multiplicity also with alternatives. Multiplicity makes you aware that there are so many different ways of analyzing a phenomenon, of trying to understand it. So these different ways of knowing something. While the alternatives are an invitation to think what is going to follow now. Which kind of actions can be taken that will be decisive or perhaps not decisive for shaping a different kind of future. So it makes you think, and I think this link between knowing and acting is a very important one. Now, in terms of actions, you have many more constraints. If you just want to know things, the multiplicity, you also enter the realm of the imaginaries, which are one part of how we know, and imaginaries play a very important role in our ways of knowing. But once you come to action, there are constraints. And I think the bridge here probably is the theme of stories that you brought up. Because stories allow you to explore how it could have been or how it could be in the future. It does not mean, the probability of it actually happening or having been so is another matter, but it allows you in a sequential way, because you have to move, a story moves from point A in time to B and C. So there is some kind of sequence in there, which must not be logical at all, but there is a temporal sequence built into every story. And I think this is the power of storytelling that allows you to explore different ways and somehow to bring together knowing and acting, which very often is so far apart and we don't quite know what to do with it.
Yes, the issue of constraints and bounding, I think, is very important partly because STS really likes to deconstruct. which is important. But the question is, how can we become constructive again? And I've tried to say that Luddites were constructive. They were not, although they were seen as machine smashers, they were in fact constructive. They wanted to build an alternative society. So for me, what is very important is how can we construct alternatives, and for STS people to be engaged in the constructing of alternatives, which means also constructing constraints. And I think modernity has done it in a way which is trying to say, for example, there is universal knowledge about the body. So we have a body in healthcare which is universal, and we develop medicines that can be applied to all human bodies. Well, we need to come to terms with the fact that there are very different bodies that work very differently, so we need to develop more contextual solutions, more varied solutions. So for me, knowledge production needs to take into account contexts and needs to accept that there are alternatives bounded by specific context, but at the same time we need to have a language for the context to talk to each other, because there is also a kind of generic, so interfacing process. So for example, if you think about standards, so standards, you know, we want to develop universal standards. We need to develop local standards, open standards that can talk to other standards, which would allow more local appropriation of knowledge in a specific way, but at the same time allow communication and circulation. So I would like to keep the circulation connectivity of the modernization, which brought, you know, that it was a kind of major advantage of modernization, but allow more local appropriation. So I would see that as a major, let's say, rule of thumb for the bounding process.
Great. Judith or Andy, do you want to come in on that?
Okay. Whatever. I am not exactly sure if I am going to answer the question, but in any case, the issue of policies, particularly when you are worried about inequality and the built-in inequality that in many ways science and technology, the way they are performed and oriented today, some people say, okay, the way to fight inequality through science and technology policy is to growth. Put science and technology for economic growth, because economic growth is going to build jobs, formal jobs, and this is true. This is true, but this is absolutely insufficient. If we don't put together science and technology policy at the direct service to fight inequality, many, many issues that relate with well-being, to being included, to not being excluded, to exercise the right to live a good life are not going to be solved. So the problem is science and technology policy today committed to the fight against inequality? We would say no. But we can ask the question in another way. Is fighting against inequality, is fighting for social progress for everybody a goal for a science and technology policy? I would say yes. Of course, the result would be a quite different science and technology policy, but why not? On the other side, social policy, let's say, all kind of. Do they think that science and technology can be really a tool at their service? I should say no. And so I would think that making dialogue, science and technology policy and social policy, and come together and know what the problems are and build together possible solution is one of the, I wouldn't say best, at least is one good way of trying to solve this kind of divorce that today is so damaging, particularly to equality.
So the point was about multiplicity, and I just 3 quick lines on that. One, just to take Helga's point further about alternatives, the radical importance of that. To the extent that representative democracy has any claims whatsoever to be democracy, it's about that. In the US, there's effectively a choice of 2. In North Korea, there's a choice of 1. And one doesn't have to be, it's not a particularly political point to say there is a difference. Just that extra 1. So that there's something radical about alternatives at all, just a discourse of alternatives, even if the alternative is highly impoverished. Secondly, that, I don't know, it's a reflection, I think, of this overblown anxiety of modernity and of power needing to justify itself, that as soon as you talk about multiplicity, then suddenly there's just this complete loss of nerve. Oh, that means anything goes. That means we can't do anything. And I really don't know where that idea comes from. We all count from infant school. We know there's a difference between a number of things and infinity. No one is saying there is infinity of things to talk about or do. They're just saying there's a number of things which are, under different views, equally legitimate, equally sensible. And let's just be able to, infant school kids can get their head around that. Politics should as well. And then the final thing is, in relation to knowledge and action again, that it's even more extraordinary that the closure is enforced on knowledge itself. There's nothing about the need to act, to commit to action. And sometimes in standards, as Johan just mentioned, you have to really, the exquisite uniformity of the HTTP and the web. Without it, it wouldn't work. So standardization is absolutely global, absolutely uncompromising. That doesn't mean we can't entertain different imaginations of possibilities just because there needs to be a decision, even where that's the case, which is not as often as we say. We can still keep in play the only people who don't want us to keep those in play are the powerful interests that want to lock in and make us think there's no alternative. So there's no reason at all for not keeping imaginations of progress open, I think, even if we prioritize the need to act.
Yeah. I would like to come back to the connection between modernity, technocratic expertise, and this is related to science and technology policy. I think it is also, modernity has come up in almost every presentation here, or what I called the ghosts of modernization theory. And when we speak about policy, especially science technological policy, it's a technocratic way in which we are advising, in which the problems are being framed, and in which the solutions are being framed. And yet I feel this repositioning of expertise that is a big challenge for the social sciences in particular, not only, but in particular for the social sciences, makes it necessary to reflect what is one of the strengths of social science expertise. And it is that we are experts in reflective contextualization. We are able to see the context, analyze the multiplicity, I would even say, of contexts, and reflect on them. And this is something that has to be brought to the force. It will not happen by itself, but there are very strong countercurrents in society that will challenge us if we don't want to become completely irrelevant, drowning in fake news, because this is what is happening. What is the difference between what you say? You cite the publications. I can cite many other publications. Or you go to, I think part of the American climate denial has also to do with the fact that many of these issues are being debated in courts. The courts are not trained to decide on scientific issues. They have a legal framework which is completely legitimate. But then this is brought back as something, it's just an opinion, or you have 50% saying this, 50% saying that. So this is what is challenging scientific expertise and also social science expertise. So unless we are able to reposition ourselves in our capacity of reflexive contextualization, of saying, as Johan and you have done with, bringing up the example of frugal innovation, This is a reflexive contextualization of the situation in which these premature babies find themselves in hospitals that cannot afford. This has to be brought forth in a much more systematic way. And I think the report encourages the readers and the listeners to do precisely that. But let's not forget, we are being challenged right now by what is happening in society, and the internet is just a way of accelerating what is going on. It's not the cause of it. It's accelerating the kind of dilution of expertise which was tied to modernity. It's the outcome of the technocratic expertise ideal that has lived its day.
Thanks, Helga. I'm going to go to Phil, and then I'm going to go to Carlotta, and then three at once. I'm going to go to my colleague at the front.
Hi there. Thanks for a great series of talks. It sort of relates to the issue of multiplicity, and it's to do with the capitalism point. And maybe I misunderstood, but I guess it relates to Helga's presentation more, because I think maybe it seems that there might be a bit of a tension between sort of the commitment to go against the TINA, there is no alternative approach. But I think what you said in your presentation was something like capitalism's here to stay, markets are here to stay, corporations are here to stay. So I'm just wondering if there's a tension there in that, whether there's at least the option left open in the report that there may well be economic experiments and models occurring in the 21st century that are not necessarily built along capitalist lines, because economic systems come and go, feudalism, capitalism, and there may be something that doesn't necessarily have to be within the capitalist framework.
Thanks, Phil. And if you could, we'll go directly to Carlotta. Thank you.
I think this whole multiplicity issue is very important. But it's also good for us to look at each technological revolution as a sort of space, a set of tools that we can use in many directions. If we look at mass production, which began with Ford in 1913 and actually became a form of producing in various societies, we find that the same principles of mass production were used by Hitler. Not only did he build all the tanks and all these things with mass production methods, but he also killed the Jews with mass production methods. I mean, the whole paradigm was there. It was used by Stalin, who also managed to kill a lot of people in mass production at the same time as he organized society in a different way. And then we have the Keynesian democracies. And the Keynesian democracies were so different between the US and Sweden. And you look at the fascist systems, they were also very different. Italy, Spain, Germany, and Japan. And the same thing within the communist system. North Korea, Albania, the Soviet Union, and China. And they were all using mass production methods. So the technology, one could almost say, was sort of neutral. It could be used in all sorts of social ways, but it wasn't neutral, because there are some limits. It was all, and the reason why there were only two parties in one place and one party in another is precisely because they were all born in that mass production system, which tended to be centralized, to be a pyramid with a center. Very, very little. In fact, not only, there is a difference, but they were all sort of like in the middle. They were all sort of like center right, center left. Now we have a horrible range, as horrible as it was in the 1930s. But the thing is that this set of technologies does not homogenize. That was, Mao Zedong dressed everybody in the same, children, women, men, everybody with the same little blue thing. And Ford said, you can have any color as long as it's black. That was the nature of that set of technologies of that revolution. The nature of this one is infinite variety. Information technology allows such an enormous variety that what Andy was saying about multiplicity gets multiplied almost by many times. So that means, and not only that, it's also globalizing technology. So being a globalizing and diversifying technology, it opens possibilities that are almost unimaginable unless we decide not to imagine them. But if we want to, the possibilities are enormous, but they are tied to this set of technology. And we should neither go back to the mass production, everybody the same, nor to ignore the fact that each set of technologies, this one is about networks, it's about flat structures, it's about other things that don't have to do with the pyramid and not with the homogenizing force.
Thank you. If you could pass that to Joe and we'll get it over to there, or go that way, yeah.
Hi, my name is Sunny and I'm from India, part of summer school. So my question is to Susan. I'm a bit afraid the role of religion, and I want to know about religion and spirituality, but because in South Asia, especially in India, we are facing the rise of a religious fundamentalism. And when you talk about religion, yes, I know that religion has a great role in social progress, yes. But when it comes to religions, which religion, my religion is better than yours, and when it comes to spirituality, that can be adjusted, what I face in India. So that's one problem I face with this social progress idea. And second idea, because suppose in specifically Indian case, the idea of caste and untouchability, that's ingrained in the idea of religion. So when we talk about science, technology, and social progress, taking the idea of religion together, so it's for people from the marginalized community, it's really dangerous for us. And also because there's a rise of communalism, like hatred against the minority. At that point, it's a bit dangerous to use religion, but yes, spirituality can address this. That's one point. And again, the one last point is social progress, yes, but so who are the actors? Who are the actors and for whom it is doing it? Because from the global South perspective, many of our problems have our roots in colonial past. So with sort of ideal social structure we want, and that's why the idea Andy talked about, like multiplicity, yes, multiplicity can give us some sort of relaxation, but this is again a question which just came to my mind. I'm a new person to this system. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonny. Okay, so we've some big cans there, capitalism and there is no alternative versus essentially long-term incumbency, actors over the long term, institutions over the long term, systems, mass production, the multiplication of possible direction, super directionality now perhaps, and some comments on religion. Suzanne, maybe I'll come to you first again on religion as definitely.
Okay. Yes. So one thing I will say is that the whole chapter that appears in the forthcoming volume deals with these questions a lot better than I can right now in this spot, because this was actually one of the it was one of the big concerns, because it's not as if there's no such thing as religious conflict. This is real, and it has really important consequences. In some of the things I think about, for example, in terms of just technology, can be things about how certain kinds of technological, say, infrastructures can reinforce, these sort of communal separation. So there's some really, well-known stories about this, of course. And one point I would make, which is by no means a full answer to your question, is that one way of kind of grappling with these problems is starting to get a better understanding of how they can be structured by especially technological, but also other kinds of technological or scientific circumstances, which is to say that, that you can have some rather deep-seated conflicts that you can show to be not just religious conflicts, but also technological conflicts. This sort of opens up a little bit of a space to say what happens if we make some kind of shift, in how people live, for example, what resources they share, what resources they don't have to share. That might offer at least some kind of space for starting to address conflicts in some places. But one other point I would say that I always say the authors make, I was very much the sort of junior partner of this particular group in terms of my knowledge of religion, which is my own knowledge of religion is based on my own research. So it's much more narrow than this group. Is that one point that they make repeatedly is that there are points, or there are kind of religious organizations that you would not want to partner with. that you have to look these things square in the eye. If I say, I don't think that, just to use an American example, I don't think that there is any useful partnership to be had with climate deniers. It's just, I can't think of one, not at this moment. But it's, I think, trying to make sure that we're not reducing or always seeing religious conflict as nothing but religious conflict, I think can be sort of helpful in kind of thinking through these things. So I mean that's at least a sort of partial answer to this, but I think the chapter addresses this more fully, in a lot of different aspects.
Thanks, Suzanne. Does anybody want to deal with capitalism? Helga, you said capitalism, yes, but earlier. What's the but?
Well, there is clearly not one capitalism either. So there is a multiplicity of different capitalistic forms, and it keeps evolving and it keeps changing. You will find in the report many contradictions, both within chapters and, of course, between chapters. This is inevitable. And it was just limited also in terms of the steering committee. You cannot just, interfere. So these are contradictions that are there. And as always, you have the questions. I mean, we're all betting on the future that is uncertain. We are thinking maybe forces can go in the direction where we would like it to go, but we also see relations of power, we see other forces that push in the other direction. So you have this, I would say it's an inherent uncertainty that is related to the way how we face the future. Nevertheless, through the way how the report is structured, if I said, markets are here to stay, it's what comes through in the report very much so, but it's also a challenge. And here I would like very much agree with what Carlotta said, but also you cannot just divide any technology from the social organization of that technology and its embedding. And I agree with Carlotta that, today we have an enormous variety, an enormous possibility. At the same time, what we are seeing right now is a concentration of economic power in a few very big corporations. We see the struggling that states have, what the EU is now trying to undertake, of regulating at least a bit of this enormous concentration of power. So the technology always comes, as Johan's first principle reminded us, it comes with the social organization in which it is embedded. And this is where we have to work and to see what can be done in order to open up possibilities that go in the direction of what we call a better society.
Is it time? Yeah. Well, the future of capitalism for me is also an issue of definition. What is the definition of capitalism? Is it about capital accumulation in the hands of a few people, which is the kind of core definition. For me, I believe more in the Schumpeterian definition. So capitalism, the core of capitalism is setting innovation free. So what capitalism did was giving power to the people who innovate. And they then, and that's more relevant nowadays. So I think we can think beyond capitalism when we rethink innovation and how we innovate. We will get a different type of capitalism, I think. So in that sense, yes, we think beyond. On the question of Carlotta, I'm not sure whether technological opportunity, so ICT, is the kind of source for hope of reorganizing society. For me, the source of hope is the mobilization around the problems generated by mass production, if you want to use. So we live in a society where there are a number of problems, inequality, climate, you can look at the Sustainable Development Goals. These problems are so deep that societies need to answer them. And because these problems are sustained and deep, and mobilization is happening, and ICT can play a role in the answers, but it can also play a bad role. It all depends on how we work with ICT.
Okay, we're running out of time. I think I see 3 hands, so I'm going to take them, try and be brief, that would be great, and I'm going to ask a very brief closing piece from each of our, and you can deal with any other questions you want, or something else. Okay, so we've got a colleague up the back, and I'll give you...
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I have been following the panel since earlier next year, and really glad to see how it's unfolded. But I just noticed the book about social funds, so my question, to keep it short, is how we deal with our internal politics. That we talk about one voice of social sciences, but we know we fight with each other about ideas. Yes, ideas flow and distribute and may have vibration and build things and change things. But there are also some big ideas, as Big Famous said. I think we are doing, a lot of effort we are doing here is to undo those concepts or ideas are no longer useful. So for me, I have been struggling with our identity and our own politics as social sciences or as those looking into science and technology and criticizing. How we can do self-criticizing and how we, before we presenting ourselves as experts, how we can justify our role and to let the society or to justify our calling that we have a role in society.
Super, thanks. And I'm going to take one right there.
Hello, thank you for this great discussion. I have 2 questions, very brief. One is about the process. How did you arrive with this report? Because you're talking about pluralism and diversity and multiplicity, but I'm wondering how plural was the way you collected these technology stories and which actors were included, and and if there was kind of some participatory approach or not. And the other question is more related with the science and technology policy, and it's more about your opinion about if there is still some space for basic research that is still disconnected with the social challenges, because I think, we can see in the social policy, or just more science policy space, that there is increasing emphasis on useful research. So I don't know if that's your opinion on just basic research, just because of the value of knowledge. Yeah.
Thanks. And the last one I'm going to take is that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed all the presentations. Just quickly, I like the idea of the focus on human dignity and social justice as a driver of the future of social progress. And I think considering the role, thinking about the entire humanity. That is wonderful. But I would like to ask just two questions quickly. Number one builds on a question that the gentleman over there asked about how do we, is there a space for dealing with legacy historical issues, specifically issues around racial injustice and colonialism, where we still see the patterns that have created certain patterns of failure in a lot of countries in the global south. That's number one. Your thoughts and your reflections on that. Was there in the report, is there any attempt to even try to discuss these things, considering the burden that the global south carries around global inequalities? And my second question goes to the thinking around values. And that is, how can these values, sometimes that have been violently inculcated in a lot of these nations that are not doing well, how can they now be democratically changed? How can they be democratically corrected, considering that a lot of these values that were that have kept a lot of these countries in the global south, a lot of those values were violently inculcated in them. How do we now say that we can use democracy or democratic systems to correct this? Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, clearly we're not going to have time to deal with all of those questions in the way that they should be appropriately dealt with. There is huge amount of resource online and being published. But I will give the panelists about 30 seconds each to answer any that they can in that time, to reflect on them. And I promise you, each of them will be having drinks in the Arts Cafe building, which is right there. You're all invited to join us to do that, and I hope you can do that, and to follow up on some of those questions and indeed others as you go. So I'm going to start with Andy and come this way.
Yeah, I'll just try and join the last comment with the first. Yeah. And the issues you raise are exactly why I am more worried about power than capitalism. Capitalism is an instantiation of power, but there are so many others, and they have similarly perverse effects. Power is not a bad thing. It's when it's concentrated, as like no other area in colonialism. So, and it's there that I feel that making space, not trying to engineer on behalf of others, but make space. It's a responsibility, the privilege to make space so that the suppressed agency can come forward in the issue you raise as elsewhere. And that goes then to expertise, the question about expertise, because Helga made a very good defense of expertise, and it is, of course, something very precious. But I fear that it's a conduct of expertise, not acknowledging that no matter how expert it is on social science or anywhere else, it never determines an outcome. And so it is a responsibility always to explain the plurality and conditionality of the interpretations. And it's a failure of expertise, arguably, to do that has provoked the populism backlash that we're now so worried about. So I think less can be more. If expertise in panels like this, as elsewhere, at the IPSP, conduct themselves in their more plural fashion, we might find the threat is diminished.
Suzanne.
I have much less to say. I have much more to think about. Actually, this isn't a response to any direct question, but I've been thinking a lot about Helga's point earlier about the idea of the imaginaries, the socio-technical imaginaries, or really the ability for people to kind of come forward with kind of perspectives on how things could be organized. And really some of this comes out in practice, not just in talk. I mean, I think it's sort of important to pay attention to the small ways that in everyday life people negotiate their way around some of these problems, and try to think and you know, kind of going with the idea of making space, of taking those small efforts much more seriously maybe than we do as a launching port for having different sorts of imaginaries about how things could be done.
Well, I would like to take the question about how we can justify our role in society with the question about basic science. And I would say that both have in a sense, the same answer. Our role in society and our responsibility is to understand with deepness. Because if we understand with deepness, we were able to help other people to understand. And this is one of the roles of basic science. Basic science is not only physics, biology, or mathematics, it's also philosophy. It's very, very important. It's very short-sighted to put them aside in the name of some kind of practical stuff. But the issue is we need to understand with deepness. This is our role. And I would underline, it's our responsibility.
Yeah, I would like to speak to the same two questions. For me, basic science is very practical. So the idea that basic science is not practical is a misunderstanding. So if you are a basic scientist, and science in Wissenschaft in a kind of broad sense, so including, you need to be able to understand, you need to be able to explain what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that's also for me the justification for social science. Social science needs to be able to explain to anyone in society what they are doing. Because there's no entitlement. The entitlement comes from the performance, from the act, from the communication, but not from the privilege.
Okay. So let me briefly say one word about the process itself. As you can think, getting 350 people from being as inclusive as possible and being aware of diversity, again, to the extent that is possible, and yet trying to reach a product where we speak with one voice, was perhaps enabled by one simple trick, namely collective authorship. There is no individual author in the whole report. So people had to sign up, and they had to fight until the end whether they can sign up to it or not. And fighting, I mean, in the sense of having productive discussions between different ideas, approaches, etc. And this was achieved. So every one of these 350 people were at least signing up to the chapter in which they were involved. About basic research, allow me a personal statement. As former president of the European Research Council, I can assure you that at least in Europe, we have been able in a truly bottom-up way to do what both Judith and Johan were saying, to fund research. By now we have some 10,000 ERC grantees in Europe. Each one of them has on average 6 to 7 team members. So you multiply this in all areas of science. The social sciences and humanities have, in a bottom-up, demand-driven way, a part of the budget that is now reaching 18%. And personally, I must say, I read an article that I find interesting, I open a book that I find interesting, and there is an acknowledgement that this has been funded by the ERC.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, firstly, to all of you for coming, for participating, for staying right till the end. Very much appreciated. I want to thank all the people who helped pull all of this together. Rebecca and Becky, thank you very much. I hope you found some of this useful, tools to think, tools to do, tools to map, perhaps to tell stories. I'd encourage you to read the other material, and I would encourage you to join us for a drink. As I said, if you go out that way and turn right, we'll be right down there. And lastly, to our very international panel, thank you very much. Appreciate it.